Here's the question. Happy Thursday morning, by the way. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? And during this quarantine, has that changed in any way? Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? And has that changed during the course of your quarantine experience? We are looking at Jesus' first lessons post resurrection. Incredibly insightful. We've all heard about the road to Emmaus. In fact, there's programs that use the word Emmaus. There's experiences that people talk about, road to Emmaus. But here's the legitimate road to Emmaus. We pick it up in Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 16. And so, and behold, two of the disciples were going that very day to a village named Emmaus. It's about 7 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And verse 14, and they were conversing with each other about all the things which had taken place. This is right after the resurrection. There's a buzz going around, death, burial. There's a lot to talk about. And so they're talking about this whole experience. Verse 15, and it came about that while they were conversing and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. Verse 16, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. Two disciples traveling to Emmaus, conversing about what had just happened. Death, burial, rumor of his resurrection. These were two of the disciples that would have been in the room that had a discussion in verse 11 of chapter 24 in Luke, where they would have been some of those that said, oh, the resurrection, it's nonsense. Can you imagine? I mean, this was on their rap sheet. They believed that when it was exposed to them that Jesus rose, they said it was nonsense. So these were two guys that would have been those that thought the resurrection was nonsense. And Jesus, out of nowhere, begins to walk with them. And they don't recognize him. Somehow he prevented them from recognizing them. I think it's kind of the reason he did that is because it's like the fly on the wallpaper. He wanted to have a discussion with them in a way that they wouldn't be intimidated to be talking to him, and they would reveal their true colors. This way he would see what people are really saying, and he could interact with what people are really thinking and what people are really saying. Now look at verse 17. And he says to them as he begins to walk with them, what are these words that you're exchanging with one another as you're walking? And they stood still looking sad. So then in verses 18 through 24, Cleopas, they've identified one of these men, Cleopas, looks at Jesus and basically says, are you the only one on the planet that doesn't know what's going on? Where have you been? You've been hiding under a rock someplace? By this question, Luke, who's recording this, is pointing out Jesus' ministry and death was known by everyone in the area. So there's no excuse to be ignorant of Jesus and his ministry. It was really judging what was the extent of his ministry. So they explained to Jesus, well, Jesus had a great run, but the chief priests, well, they delivered him up to death. And then in verse 21, they say something that's very insightful that I think is an indicator of what our attitude is many times. They said, we had our hopes up that he would deliver us. We had our hopes up that Jesus would deliver us. See, isn't that us? We want our deliverer to make our life physically convenient in the here and now. Hey, the coronavirus is around us. Jesus, we want you to lick this now. For them, the Roman Empire. Deliver us from the Roman Empire. Lick the Romans so that we can be delivered from the Romans. Same problem today. We look for Jesus to save us from our physical circumstances rather than our spiritual quandary that we find ourselves in. Now look at verses 25 and 26. And he said to them, O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Verse 26, was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory? So basically, Jesus, still don't know who he is, but Jesus chides them for not understanding and believing. You wonder, would Jesus chide us for just being so preoccupied with our physical circumstances we don't peer into the spiritual reality? Well, then in verses 27 through 35, Jesus explained the story of the Old Testament. This is like Seminary 101. He gives them let me show you that this Jesus came to die. And he was prophesied about. Let's look at it from Moses through the prophets. Jesus came to die so that people could be forgiven of their sins. And then he sits down and eats with them, and all of a sudden, they recognize who he is. He allowed their eyes to be opened, they saw. And it's as if they became the first insightful seminary graduates that go, okay, I get it. And then they stop in their tracks. They're on their way to Emmaus. They stop in their tracks. They go back to Jerusalem to teach the rest of the disciples. Here's the message, guys. I don't know how we missed it, but this is why Jesus came. Now, here's the lesson. If Jesus delivered us from our physical stresses, well, we would still eventually die. Jesus addressed the bigger issue. Where are we going to spend eternity when we die? And see, the question that we need to wrestle with is, what will it take for us to value eternity more than we value the here and now? What will it take for people to value eternity more than they value the here and now? And why don't we value eternity more than we value the here and now? That's a tough one to wrestle with. But see, that was what Jesus was driving his apostles post-resurrection. Guys, I'm not going to be physically around. There's a bigger story. It's the spiritual story. It's a story of eternity that doesn't end at our grave. It's a story well beyond our 50, 60, 70 years. It's a story of infinity. And so wrestle with that. We'll look again tomorrow at what happened immediately after this encounter with Jesus' apostles on Friday morning. So have a great Thursday. We'll see you tomorrow morning.